Good afternoon, and we welcome you to the first Constitution signing celebration of ACC, and we're pleased you're here. My name is Peck Young. I'm the director of the Center for Public Policy and Political Studies, which along with the government department is sponsoring this first event, and we're pleased you were able to come. We're hoping that more of us will join you, but we want to keep this on schedule as much as we can because I realize at the lunch hour, some of you are taking time away from your class day to join us. This is a special event, and we have a special speaker, and we want to move our introductions along so you can hear him and not us. It is my pleasure to start things off by introducing a good friend, the Dean of the Department Social and Behavioral Sciences. I should know that by heart, and I apologize for not. Galen Scott, who works with my center and has since I came here, and has been an invaluable part of everything that's done here at ACC. Dean Scott.
Thank you all. It is my honor and pleasure today to introduce a friend and a colleague and someone who's very involved in civic engagement activities, civic education, ensuring that our democracy works the way we want it to work with informed citizens. She's also our Vice President of External Affairs here at Austin Community College, Dr. Molly Beth Malcolm. Dr. Malcolm has a Doctor of Education in Educational Administration with a focus on community college leadership from the University of Texas at Austin. Feel free to wave. Yes, there you go, hook 'em. Dr. Malcolm has had a distinguished career committed to education at every level. She's worked to improve public education as a teacher, a counselor, and a coordinator of school counseling and drug-free schools programs. She's had extensive public policy experience at the local, state, and national levels in elected and appointed positions. She's also found time for a long list of civic involvement activities for which she is the recipient of numerous awards, which we will not list right now. As Vice President of External Affairs, Dr. Malcolm is responsible for maintaining the college's relationships with local, state, federal, and business interests across ACC's very large service area. In this role, she also oversees the Center for Public Policy and Political Studies and serves on its board. And as I say, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Molly Beth Malcolm.
Thank you, Dean Scott, and it certainly is my pleasure to get to introduce Professor Richard Herrera from Arizona State University and to welcome him to ACC. And by the way, Dr. Herrera is a Texas native. He was born in San Antonio, and he received his bachelor's and master's degrees from St. Mary's University in San Antonio. And we hope this trip back to Texas makes you a little bit homesick to get back in Texas. But here in Texas, we're always trying to pull our best and our brightest back home, and Dr. Herrera is certainly one of those, and we're glad to have him here. Dr. Herrera has a particular interest and expertise in American politics and the American political system. His widely read research has focused on American government institutions, the founding documents of our nation, and how the system has grown into the government that we have today. Dr. Herrera joined the Arizona State University faculty in 1989 after receiving his PhD from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Professor Herrera has contributed articles to the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and Public Opinion Quarterly. And his current research focuses on U.S. government, their ideology, policy agendas, and representative functions. You know what we're celebrating here today is Constitution Day celebration, and one of the most interesting aspects of our Constitution is the Electoral College, and it's very mysterious sometimes to a lot of people. So we're glad that you're taking time out from a busy day to come and learn more about the Electoral College. And that's what Dr. Herrera is going to talk about, and I'm sure other things as well. As Texans, we're excited to have one of our own come back to speak to us. So please join me in giving Dr. Herrera a mighty Texas welcome back to Austin.
Thank you so much, and it is always nice to come back to Texas. Haven't been to Austin for a while, so it's good to be here as well. And I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about the Electoral College. One of the things that I regularly teach. I teach American government classes. Many of they're very similar to the ones you're currently in, and so I've become even more familiar with it preparing this talk. There we go. So the presidential selection process, that's what we're generally talking about when we talk about the Electoral College. And it's found in the Constitution, most notably in Article 2, but it's in various places in the Constitution, reflecting amendments that have changed the system here and there. And it was signed, of course, the Constitution by the framers on September 17th, 1787, which is, of course, Constitution Day. So that's what we're celebrating. Okay, so the Electoral College, what is it? And where did it come from? Well, of course, it came from the framers, right? They're the ones who came up with this idea. And the idea is that America elects its president indirectly, with individuals chosen by the states based on their representation in Congress, okay? And I'm going to go into more details about how that all works out, but that's the general idea. Now, the framers of the Constitution debated lots of things, as you know, since you've been taking American government. They debated things like representation in Congress and came up with the bicameral system, for example. They debated things like slavery, whether or not to include, to ban it then or not to, and what that was going to look like, right? In addition, they debated issues like the Second Amendment, Article 2, which deals with the presidency. What it's going to look like. Is it going to look more like a parliamentary system, or is it going to look like a king? What's it going to look like, and should we even have a presidency, right? Once they decided, yes, we're going to have a presidency, then they had to decide, okay, how are we going to choose who that person's going to be? And they debated lots of things, and they went on for quite a while. If you remember, the Constitutional Convention takes place in Philadelphia in the summer. And Philadelphia in the summer is probably even worse than Austin or San Antonio in the summer in terms of the heat and humidity, right? So since they couldn't come to a fairly quick resolution, what they did was they decided, for now, what we're going to do is decide, Congress will decide who the president's going to be. So that was their sort of operating assumption at first. But they appointed a committee of 11 people, 11 of the signers, to get together and kind of hammer out some alternatives and see if they can come up with a better idea. And these are the top three, you might say. They came up with lots of ideas, but probably these are the three that we most look to as the alternatives they came up with. One was, just like I said, the selection by Congress of who the president would be. Second was to let the state legislatures decide, right? And third, a direct election. And there were reasons why they didn't choose these. Selection of the Congress by the Congress would be very similar to a parliamentary system, where the Parliament would decide by vote who's going to be the Prime Minister, for example. You see that in England and other parliamentary systems, right? And so they didn't really want to move in that direction, and also because that selection would have thrown off the balance, as you know, of separation of powers among the branches, right? The idea was to have the judicial, legislative, and executive functions separate from each other and not overlapping, at least not in the sense that one was in control of the other, right? There were checks and balances, but they did not want a complete control. That choice would have done that, right? Selection by the state legislatures, well, if you remember, at this time, they're debating an alternative, a replacement for the Articles of Confederation, where the locus of power was firmly fixed at the state level. So they were trying to move away from that because they could see that there were problems with that model. And in doing so, they didn't want to then create a presidency that then relied so heavily on the state legislatures. Direct election, they could have just had a popular vote. And of course, we know, based on other things that were going on then, that had they chosen that one, there are a number of people in this room, probably at least half of you, who wouldn't have been included in that popular vote. But nonetheless, that was an option, right, to just let everybody, all voters vote. And they were wary of that one as well, in part because they didn't have a lot of confidence in the ability of Americans at the time, given literacy levels and other things, to make informed choices. right? And there were those among the signers who really were had very strong feelings about this, insofar as they felt like they could really learn very little from the mass public, right? So you talk about people like Alexander Hamilton, who almost expresses disdain for the public's opinion, right? He was never going to go for a system in which you let individual voters, who know so much less than he does, of course, to make the choice about who's going to be the president. So what did they choose? Well, they kind of went a middle route, right? They chose a system in which there's a group of what are now called electors, chosen by the states, who cast their states' votes for president. And it's based on state choices, right? And it really is sort of a large state, small state compromise, if you think about it, because there's two parts to it, right? The entire system. On the first phase, the states would all choose by popular vote who they want to be president. That would kind of give an advantage to large states who have lots of voters voting, right, to make the choice. But then they really didn't think that it was going to result in a choice. So this model that they came up with, this electoral college process, was designed to be more of a nominating phase, right? So what I mean by that is they thought that the first phase would be sort of a nomination. You'd come up with, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 vote winners, but none of them would get the majority of the electoral college vote. As a result, the second phase would be what's called a contingent election, right, or contingency election, where it would go to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives would take the top, at the time I think it was the top 5 vote getters, and then they would decide state by state where every state gets 1 vote. So then you're back to states' powers. So it's a nod to states' rights, and they really did believe that at the time, with the exception of the first election, which they were all pretty sure George Washington was going to be the first president. After that, they figured, well, then it's just going to be a nomination phase. Similar to what we see today, that's controlled by whom? The political parties, right? So what they didn't anticipate, of course, was that political parties would take over that nomination process. And if you think back, or if you think back, obviously you can't think back, but if you've read about what was going on at the time, of course, it wasn't until the late 1820s that candidates who wanted to be president actively campaigned for it, right? So they really thought that it was going to be controlled largely by elites. States would nominate their favorite sons. No one would get a majority of the electoral college vote. The states would decide. And people like them, in particular, would be the ones deciding, right? Because they're the ones who were populating Congress at the time. Okay, so who are these electors? Well, it's an interesting kind of question because they could be people like you and me, although not likely. They tend to be people who are party activists and campaign supporters. So just to kind of give you an idea of who they might be and how it all works out. So in this upcoming election in 2016, for example, the 2 major candidates obviously are Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And in Texas, for example, the Hillary Clinton campaign, in cooperation and coordination with the Democratic Party of Texas, has chosen a set of people who are pledged to her in the event that Hillary Clinton wins the state of Texas popular vote. Okay? So you can imagine, because Texas has 38 electoral college votes, 38 people over here on this side of the room who are pledged to Hillary Clinton. Okay? They've been chosen by her campaign. They've been chosen by the Democratic Party. Then there's another group of 38 people who are electors who are pledged to Donald Trump, and they're sitting over here. And in the event that Donald Trump wins the popular vote in Texas, he gets all of those, or she gets all of those. So after Election Day, the Secretary of State for Texas chooses which set of electors gets to cast Texas's electoral college vote. Okay, so that's kind of how it works. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated because, as I'm going to show a little bit later, you don't actually have to win the majority of the vote in Texas to get all of Texas's votes. You just got to get more than anybody else, right? So the choice by the Secretary of State as to which slate or which set of electors to authorize to cast the state's vote is determined by the popular vote in the states. Now, in most states, it's like the Secretary of State of that state, so it's the chief elected official. In some states, though, it could be the governor who then appoints that set of electors to cast the state's vote. So it varies state by state because, as I was talking with someone earlier, there are 51 different elections going on and 51 different procedures that are happening, right? Ranging from how you vote, how you qualify to vote, whether you have early voting, all that all varies 51 different ways as well. The same is true for choosing the electors. Okay, so now we're getting to the math part of the presentation, and it's easy math. So the number of electors that we have in the United States is a formula of number of United States senators, which of course we know every state gets 2. And that's one of the things that's in the Constitution that is in a sense fixed, right? Unless a state voluntarily gives up their right to equity in the Senate, they get 2. You can't even change, Congress can't even pass a law that changes that, right? Plus the number of House members that a state has. So it varies, but every state is guaranteed at least 1 member of the House of Representatives. Now, this is determined, the second part of the formula is determined by the census. As we know, every 10 years, a census is taken, a count of the people. As a result of that census, Congress then takes those results and apportions House seats to each state. So every 10 years, it's possible for a state, certainly for a state like Texas, and I'll show an illustration in a minute, to gain some states after every census because of the population growth relative to other states. And since the number is fixed at 435 House seats, it's not as if a state can just get more seats in Congress without another state losing or sets of states losing. So if Texas gains, say, a seat or 2 in Congress, then another state or a couple of states have to lose congressional seats, right? Because it stays at 435, okay? So Texas has 38 electors because Texas has 36 congressional districts. So as long as you know how many congressional districts your state has, you can always figure out how many electoral college votes they have because you just add 2 to that, right? That's for the senators. What I did was pulled up kind of what it's looked like over the years. If we just go back to 1996, Texas had 32 electoral college votes. And then after the census, it gained 2 seats, so it went up to 34. After the 2010 census, it went up to 38. So Texas is one of those states that has been gaining electoral college votes because its delegation to the House of Representatives has grown, and grown quite quickly, as you can tell. It's no surprise to you, of course, that Texas is growing in population, but that population growth translates into increased representation in the House of Representatives, which then means a greater or stronger vote in the Electoral College, okay? I didn't mention, there are questions at the end, so I'm going to try and keep track of time so we have time for those in case you have any. So how many electoral votes does it take to win? Well, you can see the totals there. First of all, you need a majority of the Electoral College to win. You mean a majority of the votes. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 senators. District of Columbia, after the 23rd Amendment, gained 3 Electoral College votes. As a result, there's a total of 538 Electoral College votes available. So a majority, therefore, is 270. Okay? You can tell, since it's 538, that a tie is possible, right? So it's possible that, given the configuration of states that the 2 candidates win, that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton can each gain 269 Electoral College votes. In which case, it goes to the House of Representatives, as I mentioned, where and in this case, the District of Columbia does not have a vote, so it's 50 states, each voting with 1 vote. So now Texas's 38 Electoral College vote advantage becomes the same as New Mexico's, becomes the same as Wyoming's. It's 1 vote. So that means that the Texas delegation, all 36 of them, would have to caucus and decide how are they going to cast Texas's presidential vote. Now, because Texas has 25 Republicans and I think 11 Democrats, it's very likely they would cast for the Republican candidate, right? And that's currently, and of course it could change after this election, but it's I think pretty doubtful that it's going to change partisan control in Texas, right? From what I remember, at least. And that's the same in every state. It doesn't change all that much. But that's what would happen if there was a tie. But 270 is the goal for both parties. And in many ways, it doesn't matter how you get to 270, because once you get to 270, you're president. Okay, so, and I'll show you a model a little bit later that shows the different pathways to getting to 270 for each of the 2 candidates. Okay, so here's a map that actually shows you, I hope you can see it well, because what I put in there are well, I didn't, but I found the map, that has the Electoral College votes per state. So what this shows you is you can see the relative strength in terms of Electoral College votes that each state has. So, of course, California with 55 Electoral College votes, because it has the largest population, has the most number of Electoral College votes relative to any other state. Alaska, of course, only has 3 because of their population size. So they have the minimum. Texas is, I think, second, only to California, with 38 Electoral College votes, followed by Florida, right? And California, Texas, and Florida, I think over the last 2 or 3 or more censuses have only increased in terms of the number of Electoral College votes at the expense of other states. Remember, I said other states have to lose Electoral College votes. So states like New York and Illinois and Pennsylvania and Ohio have actually lost Electoral College votes over time because their population, relative to that of Texas and Florida and other fast-growing states, has not kept up that pace, right? So that's what explains what's going on, okay? We'll come back to this map a little later, too. Actually, we can come back to any of the maps. Okay, so here's another feature of the Electoral College system. It is a winner-take-all system for the most part. With the exception of Maine and Nebraska, all of the other jurisdictions, all of the other 48 states and the District of Columbia, allocate their electors on a winner-take-all basis. What that means is that you just have to win a plurality of the election in your state to get all of the electors. Okay, so it's winner-take-all. It's not proportional, right? So it doesn't matter if you come in second really close, you still get 0, okay, in a winner-take-all system. Now, Maine and Nebraska have chosen a different system. It's called a districts allocation system. And what they do is, for example, Maine will take the total popular vote. And if the total popular vote in Maine goes for Hillary Clinton, then she will get automatically 2 for representing those 2 Senate seats, right? They'll get the statewide vote. But then they look at the congressional districts, and there are 3 of them in Maine. So they'll look at that and say, okay, who won this congressional district? The candidate who did in popular vote gets that Electoral College vote. And they do that per district. Now, with Maine and Nebraska, you're not talking about large numbers, right? So Maine, for example, has 4. So I misspoke. They're going to give 2 to the overall winner, and then the 2 districts, whoever wins one gets that candidate's vote, and the other one gets the other. So it's not going to be a big difference. Nebraska has 5. So that's the one where it would be 2, and then there would be 3 per district. They're the only states that do that. All the others are winner-take-all systems. So as you can imagine, winner-take-all systems benefit larger states, because that's, if you're the candidate running for office, you're looking at different ways in which you can get to 270. And you might be saying, well, if I can get California, that's a huge prize. That's 55 right there. So what other states do I need to get to 270? Now, certainly you could probably get there by accumulating a lot of states that have 3, 4, and 5 Electoral College votes. But more likely, what you're going to try and do is get the ones that are in the teens, right? And we'll talk about some of those states in just a minute. But the prizes are the mid to large states where you're going to get a lot of Electoral College votes for your efforts and your campaign spending and your appearances and travel and so forth, right? So when you're starting to follow the campaigns, you'll notice where the candidates are going, right? And they're going to certain key states. And when they're not going to those states, the commentary in the newspapers and in the media is kind of like, what in the world are they doing there? Because there's no particular reason to go there, either because it's a state that doesn't have very many Electoral College votes, or because it's a state that is almost assuredly going to vote for the other candidate. So why spend your time, your money there, when you could be in a state that you actually have a chance in? Because every time when you have 60 days or less to go, if you're in a state that you can't possibly win, or in a state that you're almost certain to win, that means you're not in a state that you could be really trying to get the vote, right? Okay, so as I said, it's a plurality rule, right? Winner take all is a plurality rule. A plurality differs from a majority insofar as you don't have to win 50% plus 1, you just have to get more than anybody else, right? So in a race like this with 4 people, and I've gone ahead and put Johnson and Stein, I believe they're on the Texas ballot. If you put those 4 in there, really, if they are all closely matched, they're all getting a lot of support, all a candidate has to do is get just over 25% of the Texas vote, and they get all 38 Electoral College votes, right? The ones who also get 24 and a half, 24, that close, they get nothing because it's a winner-take-all plurality system. So to get 38 of Texas's Electoral College votes, you don't need to get 50% plus one. You just need to get more than anybody else. Now, what I did was just give an example. A lot of times people think, well, that's not fair. It should be proportional. You know, if you get 25% of the vote, you should get 25% of those 38. That's not how it works, but this is how it would work. So the percentage of the popular vote that I put in there is based, I believe, on maybe a week ago's poll of Texas voters. Like if the election were held today, who would you vote for? And these were, I think, likely voters, or if not registered voters. And this is what the percentages came out. And they were actually, for Texas, not fairly close for a Democratic Party candidate. And as you can see, Donald Trump, if the election were held today, would probably win the state with 48% of the vote. Not a majority, but close, and he would get 48. But Hillary Clinton would get 41% of the vote, which means that 41% of Texans voting in the election, not necessarily 41% of all Texans, but 41% of Texans voting in the election, she would get 0 Electoral College votes under the current system, which is the last column, winner take all, right? If it were a proportional system, if we just based it on the percentage of the vote that the candidate gets, you can see then the outcome would be different. Donald Trump would certainly win more, but he wouldn't get all. In fact, Hillary Clinton would get 16 Electoral College votes. So what does that actually mean in terms of the presidential election process? Well, it means that Hillary Clinton might be spending a lot more time and money in Texas than she is now. When she's at 48 to 41%, she's going to spend some time, although I don't think she's been here for a while. She's going to spend some money, but not as much money as she'll spend elsewhere, right? But if she could get 16% of 16 Electoral College votes by coming here and spending time and so forth and campaigning, it would be worth it to get those 16, right? But because it's 0, the incentive then for the campaign diminishes. Okay. So clearly, under this sort of system, it's possible for someone to win the overall popular vote and to lose the actual election, because the election is not decided by the popular vote, right? So while many Americans believe that how they vote is going to translate into the popular vote, and we pay attention to that a lot, and most of the polls are showing national polls, that's not how we do it. And it's possible for a candidate to actually win the popular vote, get more votes than anybody else, not necessarily a majority, but more than anybody else, and still lose because it's decided by the states. And there have been 4 instances, and you can see them, right? The last, fairly recent, in 2000, right, with George W. Bush winning the presidential election because he won the Electoral College vote, but losing the popular vote to Al Gore, right? So it doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, right? And for some people, that's a real concern, and it has caused people, many groups and organizations, as well as members of Congress, to offer up alternatives. We don't have to do it this way, so why do we do it this way? Why don't we just have a popular vote? So when you find out at the end of the election day who won the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, you'll know who the president's going to be. You don't have to wait for the Electoral College vote. There's no other funny business. There's no middle person there, like called the Electoral College. It's just a straight vote. Okay. So our electors, these people who are selected, so remember those 38 over here who I think I said Clinton was over here, Trump over there. Let's say that that lead stays what it is, and Trump wins the state of Texas. So those 38 are authorized by the Secretary of State of Texas to cast the vote. Do all 38 of them have to vote for Donald Trump? Let's say when they were chosen, they were big Trump supporters. But now they've sort of had second thoughts. Or maybe something happens in between that November election and when they cast their vote that really causes them to say, I don't know if I can do it. Well, there is a term for them that's devolved over time called faithless electors, right? Because remember, they were chosen by the Trump campaign and the Republican Party of Texas. So they are pretty much, they're Republicans for sure. They're trustworthy Republicans in the sense that the Republican Party of Texas can trust them. And they're Donald Trump trustworthy, right? They support him as compared to other candidates who ran. There have been some incidents of faithless electors, not very many. Probably I'd say a handful of them. And sometimes they just don't cast a vote. Sometimes they cast a vote for another candidate who's not even the major two. It's never made a difference in the outcome, but of course it could. So you might say, well, can states do anything about it? Can they bind their electors? Can the state of Texas say to those 38, you have to vote for whoever you are pledged to? Yes, they can. As it turns out, Texas does not, right? Texas does not bind their electors. There are 29 states and the District of Columbia that do. So they have laws that they've passed, their legislatures have passed that say if you're an elector, you've got to follow the popular will of the state, okay? Texas does not, my state, my adopted state of Arizona does not, right? I think once you're a Texan, you just can't get away, right? You're always a Texan. Even though my sign is now this one instead of hook 'em horns, because I know you're thinking, what the heck is that, right? Because everybody knows this one. The other one is a pitchfork, right? Because Arizona State are the Sun Devils, right? So that's just a little aside. But so states can bind their electors. 29 states have. So what's the consequence? Well, let's say one of those 38, let's say Texas did have a law that bound them. And one of them or a handful of them decided, no, I can't do it. So they voted for, oh my God, Hillary Clinton, right? Is there anything the state of Texas could do? Most states who have those laws would fine the person maybe $1,000. There's no jail time involved. And in fact, the few times that it's happened, they've never really kind of enforced it. Because it's a hard thing to do. Because in the end, it becomes a political choice that the person's making, or a choice of conscience. And so it's really hard to enforce. Now, I want to tell you just a little story. Most of you are not probably familiar, at least having lived through it, the 1992 presidential election. But some of you have. And so if you remember back in 1992, the two major candidates were Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. And in that election, there was a third candidate who actually, in Arizona, for example, gained 19% of the vote, Ross Perot, who's a Texan, I believe. And Ross Perot ran a fairly vigorous and active campaign, and he was really championing tax policies and conservative fiscal policies and so forth, right? Okay, so in 1992, I was an assistant professor at Arizona State University. I'd been there for a couple of years, and I was still kind of trying to figure out what I was doing in a lot of ways. But, and those of you who are professors know that it takes a little bit of time to figure out what you're doing. But somebody called in, as they usually do, they called into the political science department and said, we'd like to talk to somebody who knows something about the Electoral College. And it was one of those situations where I was in the office, and this happens too. I was in the office and some of my colleagues were not. So they forwarded it to me. So I answered, and what they want to know is the person I'm talking to on the phone is an elector who's pledged to Ross Perot. And he and a couple of his friends who are also electors want to talk to me about Arizona provisions regarding electors and whether or not they're bound and they have to vote for him because they're having some second thoughts. So we agreed to meet at a restaurant. It sounds really, kind of behind the scenes, and at the time it felt that way. You're meeting with these electors. Does Ross Perot know? No. And they even said that, you can't tell anybody that we're asking. And they wanted to know whether they were bound by Arizona law, which meant that I had to go to, it sounds like a burden, I had to go to the library. I couldn't look it up on the internet. I don't think it existed then. And if it did, it didn't have the Arizona state statutes. So I went to the library and started pulling the statutes and looking for something that has to do, looked at there was no law, and there still isn't, that bound electors to vote for the candidate that they were pledged to. So I went to lunch with them. They bought me a very nice salad, and we talked about it, and I told them, no, you're not bound to. The state of Arizona will not, they will not prosecute you. And then they asked me, well, what about the Ross Perot campaign? I said, what do you mean about the campaign? Well, they had us sign a contract that said if we didn't vote, if he won the state and we didn't vote for him, that we would be liable up to $100,000 to pay him. And I said, yeah, I'm not an attorney, so I can't help you there. But it was a surprise, eye-opener to me. I had not thought of the possibility that candidates, even though states don't hold those electors accountable, that a candidate could and have them sign contracts that say that they actually would. Now, as it turns out, he won 19% of the vote. Arizona, winner-take-all state, didn't get the opportunity to either violate the contract or vote for somebody else. But nonetheless, there are ways states can try to bind their electors. In reality, it's very difficult to do so. So, some conventional wisdom about the Electoral College. Small states tend to benefit because they get an extra boost because they get a minimum of 3 electors. So relative to other states, Alaska is really small and not a lot of people live there. Wyoming, the same thing. Both Dakotas, right? But they nonetheless get a voice. They get 3 Electoral College votes, which is not trivial, especially if you get close to that 269 split. Large states benefit from the unit rule. The unit rule is another way of saying winner take all, okay? So unit rule means that if you get a plurality, you get everything. And that's what we're referring to. And states like California certainly benefit with 55, right? And Texas with 38. That it can advantage minorities. Now, this is a little bit more difficult. And the logic is something like this. That since large states tend to have more minorities in them because large states tend to have more urban centers, and that's where a lot of ethnic and racial minorities reside, that they would gain because those states have a boost. Changes in population patterns, though, have complicated that story just a little bit. So it's not at all clear that that necessarily advantages minorities as much as the advocates would say that it does. But nonetheless, that's part of the conventional wisdom regarding the Electoral College. So compared to other systems, so this is the way we do it in the United States. So that means it must be the best way. But it does differ from other Western democratic countries. I couldn't find any that actually do it this way, right? So I think we're unique, which of course we should be, but nonetheless, it does result in some patterns. Some of these perhaps in dispute, but first of all, there is a very indirect connection between the people's choice and the actual election of the chief executive, right? So those instances where it could go the opposite, that a candidate can win the popular vote and lose the election. That's probably the most extreme case, right? So Al Gore certainly feels like he should be president or should have been president then because he got more votes than George W. Bush. But he didn't because of the way our system is set up. And so while it doesn't happen often, it can happen. And if you allocated Electoral College votes by proportion, you might get different results. Not always, but you might. Because while the Texas example would benefit somebody like Hillary Clinton, because Texas is what's termed a red state or a state that usually votes for Republican candidates, there are other states like California that are blue states, so not all 55 would go to Hillary Clinton, some would go to Donald Trump. So you might see the same outcome, but it would reflect the popular vote, some believe, a little bit more accurately. One difference between the United States and other countries in terms of choosing the president is comparatively stunningly low voter turnout, right, compared to other systems. Now, some of that's due to population differences and so forth. Some of it's due to the history of our country and the way in which we've sort of opened up the franchise to different groups of voters over time. But nonetheless, some have said that our system of electing the president actually depresses voter turnout. That if people felt like their vote was actually going to translate directly to the choice, they'd be more likely to vote. I don't know if that's true, and of course it's one of those things where you don't know it's true unless you try it out, right? Okay, so we're back to this map. I just wanted to just show again what it looks like, and this is certainly one way to look at and one of the more common ways to look at the path to 270. This is another way. This is a map that shows up on 538.com. So if you're not familiar with 538.com and you're interested in the election, you might want to look at 538.com. It's run by Nate Silver and his group, who made their reputations in 2012 and in 2010 with some of those election predictions. What they've done is they do polling, they take polls that are generated at each state, and they generate the odds, therefore, of a candidate winning that state and what that translates into. And then they generate the odds of winning the election. This is current as of yesterday. So it may have changed, because it changes every single day. They change the odds depending on what state polls have come in and what things look like. So right now, Hillary Clinton, according to them, has almost a 70% chance of being elected president because of the states in which she's ahead. And you can see the red ones, depending on how deep red they are, tells you how closely they are aligned to Donald Trump. And blue, the opposite. And where they are less clear, like Iowa and North Carolina, very close race, could go either way, right? Okay, So here are some pros and cons of the Electoral College, and you can see I only have 3. It protects the rights of smaller and rural states, right? So that's an advantage to small states. It's a system, however, that's undemocratic and may give too much power to what are called battleground states, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And it may contribute to low voter turnout. So that's just a handful. If you ask people who are scholars of the Electoral College, they would probably have a longer list than that. These are probably the main ones. Okay, so who would benefit if you change things? Would one political party benefit or the other? Well, the Electoral College tends to privilege small states insofar as they get a vote which they wouldn't necessarily have as much influence otherwise. That would help Republican candidates because they tend to win among rural white voters, right? It exaggerates the power, however, of big states with that unit rule, with that winner-take-all rule, right? Which helps Democrats because they tend to win those larger states like New York, Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, and so forth. So here's some alternatives. So polls do show that most Americans would like to get rid of the Electoral College and replace it with a popular vote or something similar. The Electoral College, maybe this was crystal clear, I really hope it was, but for most Americans it's very complicated, right? I hope it's not still really complicated to you, but it could be, because it is fairly complex. And how it actually translates votes to candidates is difficult to figure out, especially most of you are way more politically educated than the average American because you're in college, right? You're taking classes, you're already, in many ways, head and shoulders above most American voters in that respect, right? So for the average voter, it can be very intimidating to try and figure it out. So one way, certainly, because it's in the Constitution. Remember, I started it out by saying the provisions for selecting the president is in the Constitution. And this is, Constitution signing week celebration, right? So that's what we're talking about. You could change the Constitution. You could offer an amendment. But you run into, as your professors will tell you, this 2/3, 3/4 rule, right? So to change the Constitution, to amend it, requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress. The easiest way, and actually the only way it's been done, is 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to say, let's offer this amendment. You can imagine, if you're following at all what's going on in Congress, getting 2/3 of either house to vote one way or another on something is really difficult, much less something as controversial as voting for choosing the president. Then 3/4 of the states have to agree. It could take decades, if it even happened, to go this route, but it is a route that could be taken. But the second thing to remember is Maine and Nebraska. Because remember, they're the only states that don't use this winner-take-all system, which suggests something else. The Constitution, in Article 2, says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, which means that states can make changes on their own. Maine and Nebraska have, right? They've chosen a different way of casting their state's electoral college vote than all the other states. They don't do it winner-take-all, which means that other states could do the same thing. They could choose that district system. They could choose the proportional system, which I put up on the board. On the screen, which showed, if we did proportional, how Texas' vote would translate. But the key here is that the states can make changes. And I want to mention one particular type of piece of legislation that's been circulating among the states that has gotten some traction. It's called the National Popular Vote Bill. And you can read that, but basically the idea is that a state would agree to cast its electoral college vote following the national popular vote. So Texas would, if they signed on to this, and Texas has not agreed to this, but Texas would say, regardless of how the state of Texas votes for president, we'll cast our 38 electoral college votes following how the nation does. So if the nation votes popular vote for Hillary Clinton, Texas is going to vote for Hillary Clinton. You can probably see why it's not on the list, right? Because some of the states, and you do have some big states, medium states, and small states, but it's a real difficult argument to make, to tell voters in your state that we're not going to cast our vote the way you voted, we're going to cast it the way everybody else did, including us, but everybody else. So it's a difficult sell. Nonetheless, the effort has been adopted by 11 states with 165 electoral college votes. And remember, 270 is what you need, and it'll go into effect if they get to 270. So if they get some other states to agree to this and they can get up to 270, then that group of states all agree that they will cast their votes, which would, in effect, is kind of an end around the Electoral College, right? Because it circumvents it. Texas is not a signer to this. They have not agreed. Arizona is not, right? But you can see the states that are. So it has picked up traction. Arizona, actually, the House of Representatives passed a bill that would do that, but the Senate did not. So it's closer than I would have guessed, but nonetheless, you can see. This seems to be one of those proposals that has gotten more support than many others that I've seen, right? Okay. So let's turn our attention real quick to the 26th election and Clinton versus Trump. We're going to sort of, for now, ignore Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. So there are different ways to follow this race, and you've probably started to see them if you know, in your classes or elsewhere. But the key is really looking at these battleground states, which I mentioned earlier. There's about 11 states that are considered battleground state. To be a battleground state means to be a state in which the election could go either way. So remember Iowa and North Carolina, where they were not real blue and they were not real red? That's because they could go either way. Yet they do carry with them enough electoral college votes to make a difference. And so you can see the states that are listed there, Colorado, Florida, and some, admittedly, are going to make more difference than others, right? They're sort of more important to candidates than other states. So not all the battleground states are sort of equal here. And I'll give you a graphic that shows this if I can pull it up. You know, everybody puts in, no Republican nominees ever won the presidency without winning Ohio, okay? So that doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means it makes it much more difficult. If Donald Trump does not carry Ohio, his pathway to the presidency gets much more difficult. Okay, so here's some maps that I put together. They're all available to you, so they're not mine. I just pulled them. So this is one that comes available. This is on 538.com. This is the national polling average right now. So what they've done is they take all the polls, national polls that are being taken. There's a lot of them, probably a dozen of them. They take them all together, do some averaging to give you where they are. This is as of the 12th, so this is this week. And you can see it's a very close race. What's misleading about this, to the extent that it's misleading, is, of course, we don't elect the president on a nationwide basis. We elect it by states. So we don't really want to stop here, right? It's interesting. I didn't notice this till now, but, you know, with all the news about Hillary Clinton being ill and so forth, then she turns up blue just because she's a Democrat, right? Okay. This is the map I showed you earlier, which will change daily, and you can kind of keep track of how the states are trending one way or another, right? This is a cartogram kind of map, which what it shows you is, and it's good kind of to give you a sense of the relative strength of the different states, right? Certainly California is biggest, Florida is very big, and so is Texas right there in the middle. But you can see the relative sizes of the states. So if I didn't tell you which of those 11 states were battleground states, you could probably look at a map like this and start to get a pretty good idea. Now, you might pick California and Texas until you looked at that other map that showed California being really deep blue and Texas being really deep red, and then you say, okay, that's not it, but then let's look at some of the others. But you probably wouldn't pick Nebraska, San Diego, South Dakota. San Diego, I think, has more people than South Dakota. But you might pick some of those other states, right? So that's another way. Here's another vote. This is also 538.com, and what this does is sort of combines that cartogram, because you can see the relative sizes of the states, but it also then gives you the chances in those states. So combine that map that I showed you that was red and blue and had Iowa as pale and so forth. And what it does is it shows you, okay, given current polling averages in those states, this is how the states are trending, and also gives you a sense of their relative strength as well. So Florida is sort of a pale blue because it's trending towards the Democratic Party direction. But it's also enlarged relative to South Carolina and Georgia. So it gives you a little bit different kind of way to take in the same information but present it in a slightly different way. And then there's a whole lot of others I can show you. This is kind of one of the ones that's kind of nice because it shows you three different things. First of all, the popular vote, because we want to know who's gaining and others. And it's not as if the popular vote is completely irrelevant, because it does speak to momentum. And it does suggest that one candidate or another has some momentum going into the election. That can affect people's views of the candidate. So it's not irrelevant. The electoral vote projections, so right now if the election were held today, Hillary Clinton would have 301, 31 more than she needs. to be the president, right? But that's today. And this, what I like about this bottom graph is it shows you over time the sort of the forecasts. And it shows you when they've gotten close and when they've gotten farther apart. The expectation is that as you get to November 8th, they're going to get narrower and narrower. If they don't, that suggests a landslide type of election, right? Okay. And then this tells you like how important are the different states. All of these, as I said, most of them are on 538.com. Some are on the New York Times Upshot and easily accessible. Okay, let me just pull up something if I can. I think there's an easier way to do this. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay. So this is from the Upshot, and it's obviously cut off. But what I wanted to direct you to, if you're really interested in this and the different pathways to the presidency, what this shows you is, because, as I said, the goal is 270. So how do you get there? And there's lots of different combinations of states voting for you or voting for the other candidate that can get you to 270, right? So what this shows you is that Hillary Clinton right now has 94% of all the possible paths to the presidency. That's a huge advantage, right? If Trump gets, and that's if Trump wins Florida. If you take Florida out of there, his paths to the presidency reduce significantly. And so what this map sort of shows you is, or this graphic shows you is, if candidates win certain states, what does that do to their pathways? Which then tells you something about what does that do to their odds of winning, right? What's nice about this particular graphic also, if you go onto the site, is it's interactive. So you can choose for Hillary Clinton to win this state or that state and see how it changes the odds of the pathways. And I think it's really instructive if you have an interest in this, then I think it can be really helpful to kind of understand it. And then, I know I'm running out of time. Okay. I just thought I'd take you through kind of a walk through history on maps. As you can tell, I like maps because they're kind of a graphic way, really nice kind of visual way to see things. If you go back to 1964, favorite son Lyndon Johnson running for president, he carried almost all of the state, right? So that's 50 years ago, a little over 50 years ago. But as you go forward, you can see how the map's going to change a little bit. Right, so this is 68, and this is Nixon winning most of the state. And this is Nixon beating McGovern in 72. Excuse me, this is 76 with Jimmy Carter, who carried Texas, right, a Democrat. And then 1980 with Ronald Reagan, 84 with Ronald Reagan, 88 with George H.W., 92, of course, 96, 2000, 2004, 2008, and here's where your most recent elections that you're probably familiar with, 2012, and we don't know what 2016 is going to look like yet. With that, I'm going to end my remarks and take any questions that you might have.
So I heard that the argument wasn't between large states and small states, but it was between slavery and non-slave states.
Right. So that's part of the argument that took place, and it has to do with if you base it solely on population, right, direct election of the president, then some southern states felt like, well, that's going to disadvantage us because we have a lot of slaves in our states that don't count as persons, and so as a result, we might be disadvantaged relative to some northern states that have fewer, right? So that's kind of how that came into play. So it's a sort of corollary to the whole argument about, do you want large states making the decision or small states making the decisions, or do you want some kind of compromise? But that was part of that direct election. So it wasn't just that there was some distrust among the founding fathers about the ability of ordinary voters to make choices, but it was also a political argument about who would benefit from it. So that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to know what is actually then the value for the U.S. citizen to vote if it seems like there's not much influence of the regular
Right.
citizens?
Well, just because it's an indirect choice of the president doesn't mean that it's no choice, right? So how a state votes does have an influence. A state like Texas, it's very important, right? So you can imagine scenarios in which, and certainly the Clinton campaign is imagining a lot of scenarios in which they can win Texas by a small margin. If they can do that, then they get 38 electoral college votes. So voters can do some calculations on whether or not it becomes important for them to vote. We're only talking about voting for the presidency. There are lots of other ballots, right, but just on that. So while I would say yes, we have an indirect choice of the presidency, but it's not completely disconnected. So I don't want to be too discouraging either. I'm going to go back there only because your hand went up right away. Yeah.
What are the electoral votes do, or what does that happen? Because you mentioned the day of the voting, and
Right.
it would be nice to find out, but you don't because that vote doesn't happen yet. When does that happen?
Right. That happened. The actual count of the Electoral College votes takes place January 6th. Congress can change that day or two here or there, but usually it's January 6th after the election is when there is a joint session of Congress and the Vice President opens the ballots. The actual vote takes place sometime in December, sometimes late December. So, as I said, the Secretary of State for Texas says, okay, just group of voters, just a group of electors, you cast the vote. They do it, they transfer it to the Senate, in this case, in late December, sometimes very early January. Yes?
Yes, in my math class last year, one of the things we covered was voting. And one of the things that goes into the Constitution was the reason that we have the Electoral College over the popular vote is majority. You have to have a majority to win it. And by that rule in 2000, we wouldn't have had a president because neither one of them got a majority. How much does that play into this?
Right.
Do they have to take that out altogether?
Right. One of the provisions for those who advocate a popular vote election is that the winner would be decided by the popular vote, but they would have to exceed 40%, not 50%, which is the proposals that I've seen. So you would still have a candidate who has not received a majority of the popular vote. That's happened numerous times, actually. Bill Clinton was elected with less than a majority. So was Abraham Lincoln, for that matter, right? So, but that's right. It's not a majority vote. It's a plurality election if you just go to a popular vote, unless you make it or 50%, in which case there would be a runoff. And that's what that calls for. If no candidate gets more than 40%, there's a runoff, and then you would narrow it down to the top two. Then you would guarantee that you're going to get over.
You explained that it would just open up where a lot of people would run, and then somebody might just only get 20%.
Possibly, right. Possibly. So if you can get into the top two, you can be in the runoff, right. My guess is it would still be heavily controlled by the political parties, though, so you'd narrow it down to two.
But he showed there is no perfect voting system. They tried every different way, and this was probably one of the better ones that was kind of...
Right. I guess I would agree with that. Any other questions? It's been my pleasure talking about the Electoral College today. Thank you very much.
We got one more thing we want to present.
Take that off.
Disconnect you so we're not talking in two minds.
Okay. I'll leave it down here.
So the cameras can get you.
Okay.
Chris, you want to?
We really want to thank Dr. Herrera for coming and giving what is a way more engaging lecture than my students who came today and are going to hear this lecture in about a month or so. But again, thanks so much, and we gave a small plaque of appreciation, and it was a wonderful lecture, and I learned a lot, and I've taught this stuff for a long time. Again, thanks to Dr. Herrera.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And we appreciate all of you coming, and thank you, and good afternoon. We urge you to come on the 27th to Constitution Day, a debate celebration, which will be at the Palmer Event Center. It starts at 5:30. The actual activities will start at 6. There'll be free food and free parking down on Barton Springs Road, and you'll get to debate constitutional issues. It's something we've been doing for nearly 10 years now, and you're urged to come on down. You'll be able to discuss constitutional issues with legal guides and facilitators. If you have them come, you'll enjoy yourself. It's a good thing, and there's no right answers. It's a fun way to spend an evening, and we hope you'll join us then too. Thank you very much.